I'm Susan. I'm the Executive Director of Sue's Gift Gynecologic Cancer Support. Tonight we are presenting clinical trials. Just what is a clinical trial? And I'm recording this here on Zoom, and we will be able to use it on our YouTube and social media later. So with that, I will turn it over to Sherry Martin, our Patient Services Director, for introductions for our presenters tonight. Sherry?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on clinical trials. As Susan said, I'm Sherry Martin, Patient Services Director with Sue's Gift. We're really grateful to the staff from Western States Cancer Research NCORP to be providing this important information. Lisa Switzer has been with Western States for 5.5 years and serves as the executive lead for the organization. She spent her entire career in the nonprofit sector and is passionate about equity in healthcare. Ginger Lick has been working to save lives for over 20 years. First, working on immunoglobulins against blue baby syndrome related to Rh incompatibility, RSV, HIV, HCV, tetanus, rabies, anthrax, and many others. For the last 6 years, she's been fighting against cancer and enjoys taking the journey with her patients. Tara Hardcastle started her career in oncology as a research scientist in a lab studying biomarkers, circulating tumor cells, and other molecular hallmarks of tumor progression and disease prognosis. She joined Western States 6 years ago as a quality assurance coordinator and is now the Director of Research Compliance and Operations. She enjoys being a behind-the-scenes support system for the coordinators, nurse, and physicians working on clinical trials through Western States. So welcome to our speakers, and with that, we will turn it over to Lisa.
Thank you so much for those introductions, Sherry and Susan, for your work. We are very grateful to be part of this evening and share this information that we're very passionate about. We will break our presentation into sections, and I will start and then hand the camera over to Tara, who will then hand it to Ginger. So we decided to name our presentation just what is a clinical trial anyway, because in our initial conversations we had with Sherry and Susan and some other folks, it sounded like perhaps your audience might not know much about clinical trials. So we're doing our very best to put most of this in lay people's terms. And I know that Susan's going to be checking the chat box for us, and we will have time at the end for questions and answers. So for all of your guests, we invite questions. That's what we're here for. So we have been in business for 38 years. Our mission, and Tara, if you wouldn't mind pulling up the slides, I think we're going to move right in here. Our mission is to provide the people of Colorado, Washington State, and Alaska the opportunity to participate in and benefit from medical research. And we are very interested in making sure that we stay true to our mission as an NCI affiliate. Our vision is to keep hope and promise alive by the progress that we help affect through community oncology research. So, and to be put simply, our NCORP, like all NCORPs in the country, and there are 38, our mission is to bring cancer clinical trials to people in their local communities so that they don't have to travel far distances if they are traumatized, which they generally are when they've been given a cancer diagnosis. We are particularly dedicated, as I said in my biography that Sherry shared, in getting access to clinical trials for rural and underserved communities. We believe there's a moral imperative involved with our work, and that is to make sure that everyone has equal access. And there's a research imperative, and that is research can't reflect society writ large if the only people who participate in it are white men of privilege. And that is still the largest group of people who participate. So with that being said, our Tara, if you would go to the next slide, please. Our agenda for the evening is to talk first about our catchment area and our affiliates. We'll mention our research basis. We're going to talk about what is a clinical study, safety in clinical studies, and that also includes privacy, patient privacy. And then Ginger's going to talk about studies, gynecologic studies that we have open, and then ones that are potential to be opened. Our organizational structure, we were established in 1983. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We're overseen by a board of trustees who have fiduciary oversight. And as I always like to say, they're my boss and they're a really nice boss. When I say standalone entity, what I mean by that is that most NCORPs around the country are embedded in a hospital system or an academic site. We have to, therefore, because we are standalone, we have to raise money to make up for what our grant from the NCI doesn't cover. In addition to raising money through fundraising and development, like I'm sure you all know about, we have consortium members who pay dues to have access to our service, and they pay dues relative to their size and the scope of services that we provide. We meet regularly with our remote sites in Alaska and in Washington, and their principal investigators to provide principal investigator oversight and training, which Tara and Ginger do with their teams. And we're happy to say that since the pandemic began, we've been functioning successfully as a distributed workforce. And we were very lucky to be a recipient of the payroll protection plan, which again, some folks on this call might be aware of, but we were able to retain our staff. I think we've all seen that there were some new best practices that have come via COVID, and a hybrid workplace is one of those. Many of our staff really appreciate having the ability to work from home, especially now, especially when the weather starts to get bad, or if they have children. So we've been lucky to be able to do that in our organization. Where we fall in terms of the national picture, great, thank you, Tara. We are within, and you can see the breakdown here. We're down at the bottom there, but we are part of the Department of Health and Human Services. And we report up through the NCTN that is listed there, and the Division of Cancer Prevention, and then the National Cancer Institute. So as I mentioned earlier, we are funded by the NCI, which covers 56% of our funding. And we provide services to 3 different areas. As you can see here, one in Alaska, one in Washington, and then several in the state of Colorado. And my last slide is to talk just briefly about our principal investigator, Dr. Nicholas DeBella. All of the research we do, he has to sign off on. So he has a very big role. He's a retired oncologist and is actually part of the founding group for our organization 38 years ago. We have a co-PI committee comprised of the 3 doctors listed here, and they provide oversight and support to Nick and to our research team. So we're very lucky to have a group of this group of people who are very committed to research. And with that, I will turn the slide deck over to Tara, who is actually running the deck for us. So thank you, Tara.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you, Lisa. So the whole concept of clinical research and really just comes from the fact that we want to know more and learn more about healthcare and disease. When you're talking about a clinical study, you can break them down into 2 main categories. You have a clinical trial, which when you think about a clinical trial, you can think of it as something that is used or that comes into play whenever there's an intervention involved. So this could be a different approach to how treatment is delivered. It could be a new treatment, a device, radiation. It could also be something that, symptom management trial looking to prevent nausea or hair loss in patients getting chemotherapy. But anytime you hear clinical trial, it's because there's an intervention. An observational study, on the other hand, isn't necessarily going to intervene in the patient's care or treatment. The intent of an observational study is truly just that, just as it sounds, is just to observe, to collect data and information. An example would be a study looking at the rate of disease in two populations. These types of studies are, they're going to find associations, commonalities, correlations. It's not designed to prove that one thing is the cause over another. So who conducts a clinical study? A principal investigator is the person that is responsible for overseeing the research team and the conduct of a clinical study. Here we've shown just some examples. This definitely does not include everyone that might be part of a research team, but a lot of times this is kind of who you'll see. You'll see nurses, clinicians, people helping administer treatment. You'll also have scientists who are largely going to be working on the back end and are going to be involved in the data collection and analysis, and of course the ultimate outcome. You know, did it work? Did the study not work? Did the intervention work? And then depending on the type of study, you could have social workers involved as well. I want to highlight coordinators specifically because I do think that coordinators have they have a very important job, I guess, and it can look differently depending on where they're at or the type of study they're doing. But one of the reasons why I think they have a very difficult job is because if you look at clinical studies as having two main areas, one being this clinical area, which, you know, is kind of the area where your nurses and clinicians, you know, everything that's going to take place at a hospital, that's where that takes place. Those people are trained and educated. Their experience is directly related to taking care of the patient as they are on the study. And then you have this other aspect, which is the research aspect, where your scientists and data analysts come into play. And then the coordinators are somewhere in between. I feel like the coordinators have to walk this line in the middle of the clinical and the data and the outcome of the study. And they have to make sure that these two areas of research are working harmoniously together, that there's communication and that they're seeing eye to eye, that what's happening in the clinic is going to be the best for data collection and outcome of the study. I often say that the most challenging thing, I think, for a new coordinator, whenever they're coming into clinical research and training, is learning how to take a patient's experience, their feedback, their narrative as they're going through this journey, and translate it into these black and white fixed data points. It's definitely not an easy job, but it is essential for the outcome of the study. Looking at who pays for this study, these are just some examples. It's definitely, you know, not all inclusive of who you might see paying for a study. It could be a federal agency, the NIH, it could be a pharmaceutical company like AstraZeneca, or an academic center like the University of Colorado. But really what this comes down to, and you've probably maybe heard of the term sponsor, that is the entity or group that is paying for the study. So same thing with phases, another term that I think that we hear commonly, but, you know, do we really understand what exactly it means and what it looks like? Just kind of highlighting some of the key points of phases. Looking at phase one, you can tell it is kind of where things start. It's a small study, maybe lasts a couple months, not a lot of patients. And the primary focus, which is really what differentiates one phase from the next, is going to be safety. That's the primary focus for phase one. Looking at phase two, you're going to have more participants, and these studies are going to last a little bit longer. Definitely still a focus is safety. However, the primary focus at this point is going to be the efficacy. And then with phase three, again, as these studies grow, more participants, and these can go on for years in phase three, still looking at safety and efficacy. However, one of the primary focuses at this point is going to be dosing. And then phase four is your kind of post-market surveillance. And this is definitely the long-term efficacy and effectiveness. I don't want to ignore preclinical phase. This is not an area that involves patients. This is kind of before it gets to patients. This is going to be the lab-based research, everything that happens before it's introduced to the human population or human participants. These are going to be scientists, looking at the blood samples, measuring proteins, DNA testing, looking at changes happening at the molecular level by experiments done in test tubes, cell culture, like what's shown here, or animal models. The primary question with the preclinical phase is whether or not a drug has enough scientific merit for further development as a new therapeutic intervention. So can anyone participate in a clinical study? Some of the big things that you would want to consider if you were looking at a clinical study or somebody that you know is going to be, first of all, is the study focused on a specific disease or illness or condition? Is it designed for a predetermined group of individuals? Are they taking healthy volunteers as part of the clinical study? These are all kind of the major factors that initially would go into, looking at who might qualify or who might be a good fit for a clinical study. Some of the other things, there's a lot that goes into who can participate and who can't, but inclusion and exclusion criteria is a really big part of identifying qualified participants for a clinical study. This is going to be your bulleted list of who is eligible and who is not. Somebody that's eligible is going to meet these inclusion criteria. And of course, in the event that, maybe they have a pre-existing condition, this may be an exclusion factor and it may disqualify them from these studies. Move through the phases of, where their progression and, what scientists and clinicians are learning as they move from one phase to the next. You can imagine this list of inclusion and exclusion criteria for, who can participate and who can't participate. It grows extensively. So you may start out with a list of inclusion and exclusion criteria of maybe 5 points. And then by the time you get to a phase 3 study, this list could have doubled or tripled just with the information that is being learned about whatever the study is looking at. An eligible participant at the end of it, an eligible participant is going to meet all of the inclusion criteria and none of the exclusion criteria. One thing that I think is important to note with eligibility and qualifying for a clinical study is that I think a lot of people, there's a misconception that, if you are found ineligible for a clinical study, that maybe you're missing out on an opportunity to receive this life-saving intervention, when in reality, that's not necessarily true. And depending on the phase the clinical trial is in, there might be years worth of data that shows the treatment or intervention is too risky for somebody with a pre-existing condition, like let's say it's high blood pressure is exclusionary, or perhaps the risk is too great if it's given to somebody whose disease maybe isn't bad enough per the protocol or the study, and maybe what's approved on the market is proven to be just as good as whatever this new therapy or intervention is. So why take the risk? It doesn't necessarily mean that the patient is missing out on anything. If anything, it just means that there's something else already proven to be just as effective that this patient can take part in. So I just want to highlight a little bit, getting into safety. There are obviously a lot of things that have taken place over the years that have shaped where we are today with how studies are conducted and the safety that goes into making sure that there is proper oversight and responsibility and accountability. So just a few of the key points that I wanted to mention here. 1947, you have the Nuremberg Code, which basically the outcome of that was informed consent is essential. This is, of course, the document that participants are given that outlines the study, the risks, the benefits, everything that they would need to know and everything that they should know when they decide to consider a clinical study. And then in 1974, you have the National Research Act, which put forth the Belmont Report. You can read through these. I know this will be available, but this was another essential part of just kind of the progression of safety and oversight of clinical studies. And this also established the requirement for using institutional review boards or IRBs. In 2000, I'm sure some of you are familiar with clinicaltrials.gov, and that is the year this website was established. And in 2008, study sponsors were permitted to publish study records for the public to see. And then in 2015, the NCI was required to make their results, their studies results, publicly available within 12 months of the study's completion. So just a little bit about institutional review boards, or an IRB for short. This is basically a committee member. They are made up of at least 5 members of varied backgrounds or professional experiences, and their job is to provide scientific and ethical review of a study. And the purpose, of course, is to ensure that a participant's rights and welfare is in adherence with ethical guidance and federal requirements. They start with the study and then they continually review it along the way as needed. And of course, as frequently and as often as they need to. They do review changes, and part of this review might be, a new risk they have to evaluate. And as part of it, do they need to notify the patient, and how soon do they need to notify the patient? Is this change going to affect the patient's willingness to participate on the study? Maybe they'll want to withdraw and no longer be a part of it. These are all things that responsibilities of the Institutional Review Board. And all of our studies at WSCR are reviewed at least annually. There is regular monitoring and auditing of studies as well. The sponsor usually has a group that is responsible for doing this, and depending on the phase of the clinical study, earlier phase studies are going to be reviewed and monitored more frequently. It may depend on the intervention as well. The frequency really just depends. It could be every few months, or it could be every couple of years. But basically, it really is just to ensure that whoever is conducting the clinical study is keeping the patient safe, and that they're following the protocol as it was intended. They are looking at things like, is the institution submitting documents to the Institutional Review Board as they should? And not just are they submitting it to the Institutional Review Board, but are they listening to the IRB's guidance? Are they notifying the patients when they're supposed to and in the appropriate time? Another thing too that they look at, which I think they can tell very easily from looking at documents and records that are on file, is how involved the principal investigator is. So remember, the principal investigator is the person that is really overseeing the research team. So, they're going to be involved at a high level, but they also have to be involved in those day-to-day discussions and decisions that are being made too. So just a little bit about adverse events. Adverse events are, toxicities, any unexpected medical occurrence. It doesn't necessarily mean it's related to the intervention or study drug. It doesn't necessarily have to be. It really is just that, an unexpected medical occurrence. In some situations, this may be considered serious, which has more strict reporting guidelines, and of course involves more of the investigator and the sponsor's involvement for evaluating, how is it serious? And one of the things, or I guess a handful of things that they're looking at to make this determination is whether or not the events, whatever it is, resulted in one of the following outcomes that's bulleted here. So death, life-threatening, did it cause hospitalization? Did it cause the patient to stay in the hospital maybe longer? Any of those things could result in the adverse event being deemed serious. And of course, this is left up to the sponsor or the investigator. So HIPAA, I think everybody is familiar with HIPAA, and as it should, it has a very important role in clinical research. Along with every consent form, there should be a HIPAA that is provided to the patient. And essentially what this is going to be, it's a document that is going to outline, tell the patient, if you participate in this study, who's going to see the information collected, the data that's entered, who is it going to be accessible to, who's responsible for keeping it safe, who's it going to be shared with. And then of course, just like with a consent form, if the patient decides that, they don't want their data shared, they don't want their information shared with anybody, they have the right to withdraw their HIPAA, just as they do have a right to withdraw their informed consent. And then of course the privacy rule, this just establishes national standards to protect an individual's medical records and anything that could be considered personal health information or could possibly identify the patient. Just to touch a little bit on good clinical practice, or GCP, because it is important. While it's not necessarily a federal guideline, it is an international quality standard. So these are very important standards and guidelines, and the whole purpose of it is just to assure the safety, integrity, and quality of clinical trials. Of course, governments and, depending on how GCP is used, it can be transposed into clinical trial regulations. So these guidelines are incredibly important for clinical trial conduct, so much so that there is training that is required. Anybody that is involved in clinical studies and clinical trials is required to go through a course, so to speak, every 3 years that says you understand GCP, you understand it well enough that you can be held accountable to the guidelines. Some of the studies that we have at WSCR, this table right here just kind of highlights, our active studies, our follow-up studies. We have 90 active studies currently. We have 164 in follow-up, and something that we think is pretty noteworthy is that we've enrolled over 4,000 patients to clinical studies since WSCR was established. Over here, kind of on the right side of the screen, we do a lot of NCI studies. These studies can fall into a number of different areas, which Ginger will talk about in a little bit more detail. Cancer care delivery research, symptom management, treatment intervention, quality of life. These are just types of studies. We also work with industry and foundation sponsors outside of the NCI as well, which are listed here. So with that, I will turn it over to Ginger to talk a little bit more about these study types in more detail.
Thank you, Tara. That was great. Appreciate that. So yeah, just like Tara was saying, I'm going to give you a little bit more information about the 4 types of NCI National Cancer Institute trials that we're running. You probably don't remember the slide that Lisa showed us, but we're part of, we've come from National Health and then National Cancer Institute and then down from there. And under that is the Division of Cancer and Prevention. So one of their major concerns is what's called CCDR, or Cancer Care Delivery Research. And in those studies, they look at what is surrounding the patient in all aspects. There's dire need to have treatment, and new treatments come up, and patients given opportunities for the newest treatment and to get rid of their disease. But there's all these other aspects that physicians don't have time to focus on, like co-pays and deductibles and transportation when you're getting medications that don't allow you to drive, or having to be away from your house for 8 hours because you're at treatment, or and how that will affect your life, both emotionally with your family, your friends, your sleeping abilities, as well as financially, what are you looking at? What can you afford? What hardships are you coming up against as you're paying these copays and trying to meet your deductible? And I can tell you, I've had some patients who started their cancer journey, in November, and they met their entire deductible, and then come around January, they got to do it again. So they have quite a variety of ways, quite a variety of studies that help patients either navigate differently, including there's a lung cancer study that helps them quit smoking and helps them how to stay quit smoking, or a breast study that helps them understand if the lumpectomy is really necessary, or if you do treatment before that, could you possibly skip the lumpectomy and keep your breast, which can be awfully important to women. So the cancer care delivery research is not related to treatment. It is related to the other aspects that patients go through while suffering from cancer, while going through the cancer journey. The next one is kind of self-explanatory. It's symptom management. I'm I don't know, Gen X, I think. So I've been around the block for a while, and I remember watching movies when I was a kid. Chemotherapy, it was awful. People were so sick. They were throwing up and vomiting and all other types of, no, I'm still where I want them to be. Sorry, Lisa. Stop looking at teams. But chemotherapy, it tore patients apart. And that's what I remember seeing when I was a kid on TV. And so another aspect of cancer care and prevention from the NCI is not just focusing on the treatment itself, but what can we do to help manage the treatment? Obviously, there's things like Imodium or Pepto-Bismol, but we have come so much further from that over the decades with Benadryl, which kind of gives you like avoiding the initial allergic reaction to chemotherapy. Neulasta, which helps your white blood cells stay in a higher amount while you're going through chemotherapy. So you're less likely to get those illnesses and sick and have to be sequestered from getting sick due to chemotherapy. We are looking at particular studies where some people are more apt to have neuropathy. If you don't know what that means, it means tingling or numbness of the fingers, hands, lots of other places, but mostly fingers and feet, and try to figure out who is more likely to have those symptoms. And then if there's something we can do when we see a trend to help them prevent those symptoms. So that's what symptom management now, again, not just looking at the treatment for cancer, but looking at the entire picture of what a patient's going through. So then we go on to the more straightforward ones. Treatment and intervention is exactly what it is. We are mostly phase 2, 3, mostly 3, 4, some phase 2. A lot of our studies are medications that are currently FDA approved for a treatment of a certain cancer disease site. For instance, they might be licensed to treat breast cancer right now, but we want to see if they could work in colon cancer or lung cancer. So they're fully licensed. We know a lot about their side effects. We're not learning about the side effects. We know a lot of other side effects. We know what the patients are going to go through. Obviously, we're learning every day. That's the point of doing research. But we also want to know if we can make this drug work over here. So a good deal of our studies are like that. So standard of care, but changing it a little bit, looking at a drug from a new perspective. This is a sad way to think about cancer, but the further along you are, that's where we kind of start our treatment trials, because the further along you are, the easier it is to figure out if the medication is going to work. So the longer we can keep you around into stage 4, then we know that the drug's doing well. So we kind of also work backwards from that, where a medication is licensed for a stage 4 or something. Well, that's as far as I'm going to get. And then we start moving it backwards to see if we use it at stage 3, does it help prevent recurrence? Or if we use it in stage 2 after surgery, and normally we wouldn't treat it all, if we use it as prophylactically, if it will help reduce recurrence. So we have some trials like that. Again, drugs that are FDA approved for something, but we're looking at them in just a different light to see if we can help more people. And then quality of life does a little bit overlap with our CCDR research studies, but quality of life is also known as patient-reported outcomes. It's all about questions about what the patient's going through. They sometimes go side by side with the treatment trial, and sometimes they're standalone. They can ask anything to financial issues or your side effects. Do you have neuropathy, headaches, nausea, vomiting, all of those normal side effects we expect. And then it can get as in deep of, how's your relationship with your friends or your family or your significant other? Are you well supported? Do you have a group of people around you that helps you get through these things, or drives you, or can help you get food or get groceries, or all of these things? So quality of life, again, because of where we come from, Division of Cancer Prevention, we're not just looking at treatment, we're looking at the whole person, and we're really proud of those studies. So I think I've said enough about that. I think I did a lot more than I thought I was going to. Page down for me. I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about some of our studies so I'm going to translate gynecological research titles. So go ahead and go to the next page. We have 2 gynecological studies open right now, and we're looking to open 3 more. The first one here is NRG-GU006, and the industry title is a randomized phase 2 trial of radiation therapy and cisplatin alone or in combination with interleucin triapine in women with newly diagnosed bulky stage 1B2, stage 2, stage 4A cancer of uterine cervix, or stage 2 through 4 vaginal cancer. As a patient, that's a lot of words. That's a lot of things for you to hear. And it probably doesn't make sense to some extent. And it probably feels really overwhelming because it's just so many words. So I have a few more slides here, all about a trial. I'm only going to read the one that's for the patient. And that is to help a person who doesn't work in cancer every day and doesn't know all these words and doesn't understand all these combinations or whatnot, to help the patients that are going through it have a better understanding. So in this case, testing the addition of a new anti-cancer drug, triapine, to the usual chemotherapy treatment, cisplatin, during radiation therapy for advanced stage cervical and vaginal cancers. That's, I hope, was a lot easier for you guys, all of us, even me. I work with cancer every day. It's a lot easier for me to understand. So I'm going to go through a couple more slides, but I wanted to just give you an idea of how intimidating it can be when you're looking at it from the clinical side, from the physician side, trying to see it as a patient. So next slide. So just again, the bottom one, NRG-GY12, again, this is one that we do currently have open. It is testing 4 different combinations of treatment in recurrent endometrial cancer, and that's olaparib, durvalumab, cendranib, durvalumab, olaparib, and that one I'm not going to pronounce, and then cediranib. So anyway, the point of that is that when we flip the coin in this particular trial, that means that we can't control what the patient gets. The patient can't control it. Their treating physician, even though they might have a real desire that the patient get one of those, when a patient agrees to be part of the clinical trial, they're agreeing to receive the treatment that is assigned by the trial itself. And so it is a flip of the coin. No one can control it. It is back in some computer system. Lots of things are involved, but so we hope we've explained the trial well enough to our potential patients that they understand that these are the 4 options. And if you're assigned one of these options, we want you to take one of these options so that we can prove the science, because there's going to be a certain amount of patients assigned to each of those 4 arms, is what we call them, or treatment assignments. And we want to make sure that there's an equal number in each of those, so that at the end of the study that they have good details to say, okay, we've proven reasonably well that this one works better than that one, or we've proven that they all work pretty well, or we've only proven this one doesn't work as well. And that's why we need the patients to understand what they're signing up for and stick with what they're signing up for, so that at the end of the day, the science can really tell us something that's valuable, and then we can also help future patients. All right. Thank you, Tara. All right, so NRG-GY19, testing hormonal drug letrozole, which is a aromatase inhibitor for a lot of female type of cancers. And that's alone or in addition to the usual chemotherapy, which is paclitaxel or carboplatin in low-grade serous ovarian or peritoneal cancers. I think that's relatively straightforward, but it's just about adding one drug to the usual care. Like I said, there is a lot of our studies that we follow the standard of care and we just tweak one little thing to see if it's going to be better or worse. And this is an example. Again, we do not have this one open. This is a potential study we're looking at. All right, and NRG-GY 23, comparing standard of care, again, SOC, the standard of care treatment, to 3 different combinations of drugs in patients with epithelial ovarian cancer, primary peritoneal, or fallopian cancer who have received prior bevacizumab. So it usually means that they have taken the standard of care treatment and they responded for some period of time when receiving bevacizumab, but they're now advancing or progressing. So they are now looking at those 3 subsequent drugs, the 3-drug nivolumab, opelperamab, and sedimiramid. I practiced these, I did. I did. And then the other 2 arms, nivolumab and just sedimiramid, or olaparib and sedimiramid. Anyway, versus what would normally be the standard of care chemotherapy. So again, taking the standard of care, what we know, we have good research history. We've done science in the background. We've put patients on this trial in the background. We saw that the standard of care chemotherapy is good and it works. And now we have new science coming up and we want to look at that and see how that compares to the standard of care. And hopefully we find that it's better in one of those other 3 combinations. And then I think I just have one more. NRG-GY024, testing the treatment of radiation and cisplatin chemotherapy for patients with surgically resected vulvar cancers that has spread and has been detected in sentinel nodes. So our lymph system is what clears out just about everything in our system. And there's types of cancer. You start with your tumor usually itself, not in blood cancers, but a tumor usually, that's where you detect the cancer originally, and that's where you test it. For a while, it will not spread into your lymph node system as things are being, your waste is being pulled away. But sometimes eventually it will be into your node system. And so we know that it's spread past the original disease site. And so this is a medication looking at to see, once we know it has spread, if we can stop it or prevent further spread. I hope I didn't go too much in depth. I went a lot further than I thought I was going to do, but I think I'm all done. I think we just got a couple more slides. Thank you. And anything for questions?
Yes, we just wanted to thank you